Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AVR120. Today we're going to be going over how to set up ArrowInstantiation and being able to kind of have the character shoot. So we'll go ahead and begin here. So the first thing we're going to want to go ahead and do is create an Arrow prefab asset. So we've already talked a little bit about prefabs, but again, just to reiterate, they are copies of game objects that you can use infinitely throughout the scene with all the components that you've put on that game object. So we'll go ahead and scroll down here, and where we want to take a look is the Tiny RPG Forest artwork. We'll open that up. Environments, and oops, sorry, artwork, sprites, miscellaneous, and then the arrow here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and actually dock this so that we can see a little bit better. But down here we have the arrow, so we're going to go ahead and drag the arrow into the scene here via the hierarchy. So we'll just drag it into the hierarchy like I just did. And we'll go ahead and we'll add some additional components to the arrow here. So we want the arrow to have some physics attached to it, so we will add a rigid body 2D. Okay. So remember, I went to add components and I searched for rigid body 2D. Set the gravity scale to 0. For now, we're going to freeze the rotation on the Z. And we will go ahead and also add a box collider 2D. And you'll see here now that if we go to the scene view and you have the arrow selected, you'll have the collider around the arrow as well now. So once we do that, I'm going to go ahead and rename this to arrow prefab in the hierarchy. And a quick way to do that is just select the object and press F2. That allows you to rename it, or if you hold it over for long enough, it'll allow you to rename it. And then I'm going to go to my top level assets folder in the project pane here. So I'll click this and click into prefabs, and I will drag this arrow prefab down there now. Okay, so now I have my prefab set up. I'm just going to delete this arrow out of the scene. So if I right click the arrow and select delete, I'm going to leave my hero and my rock. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and create what's called an empty game object on the player, and we're going to call it the fire point. And this is where the arrow will essentially come out of the character when he presses the attack button. So I'll go ahead and I will select the character and I will right click and I will create an empty game object. And you see here that the game object is kind of attached and underneath the hero. So the way things work in Unity is through game objects kind of are related to each other is through what's called a parent-child relationship. So in this scenario, the hero is the parent object, and the object I just made is essentially what's called a child of that game object. So I'm going to rename this to FirePoint, like so. And I don't want the fire point to be right on top of the character, because if it spawns an arrow, that arrow will get stuck in the character's collider there. So I'm going to select the fire point and I'm going to move it slightly down here, like so. And because I want it to be in front of the character. So now, if we go back to the character, we're going to create another script that will reference the fire point. So we'll go ahead here. And oh, I'm sorry, this isn't a new script. It's going to be in the player movement script. So if we go ahead to the right here with the hero selected and we double click the player movement, we will see that will pop up our script here, and we're going to create another section of this script. We're going to create another method. So one thing you will notice, one problem that we're going to have, if I go back to the editor here, is that the and you can see it's compiling the scripts because we went into the scripts, so it's thinking that there is a new um, addition to the scripts there. Okay. One thing you'll notice here is so this fire point's a child of the game of the hero game object, right? So if I play this now, all right, and I'm just going to move this game window over here, and I'm going to select the fire point, and so I can actually see, like, while we're at the runtime of the game, um, I can actually select objects and like see their transforms and things like that. So if I walk around here, you'll see that the fire point's in front of the character at all times. But we don't want that, right? If he's facing right, we want the fire point to be right, and if it's facing left, you want it to be left. If it's up, we want it to be facing up, and down, we want it to be facing down, right? So we need to essentially set that up through script, which is what we're going to go ahead and do now. So going back to the hero, back into the player movements, okay, we're going to create a method, all right, and this method is called set fire point. So we're going to and let's go ahead and call it set fire point position. That's going to be a little bit better. And essentially, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use an if check, and I'm going to say if, and we already have the movement on the x-axis, right? So this is this variable represents the user's input when they're moving left and right on the horizontal axis, okay? So we're basically going to run a check on that. We're going to say if the movement.x, okay, is equal to 1, all right? So if you remember, that horizontal axis, okay, is measured in 1 and -1, okay? So if it's +1, that's right. So if the movement.x value is +1, we're going to take the fire point um, so we need to make a fire point variable here. So to hold a reference to our fire point from the scene. So I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to create a game object, and I'm going to call it fire. It's got to be a public game object here, public game object, and I'll call it fire point. And that will hold a reference to the fire point in the scene. I'm going to scroll down here, and now I'm going to say, see, now we have the fire point variable. I'm going to say if fire point, if that game object's transform, okay, and its position, all right, so essentially we're getting the object's position. We're going to set the position equal to the hero's position. Um, and so we need a reference to the hero as well. So I'll go up here and I will make a public game object, and I'll call this hero, and we will drag a reference to the hero uh, in that section there. So we'll go ahead and set the fire point transform.position equal to hero.transform.position, and we will add um, a what's called a vector 3. So a vector 3 is uh, the transform is made up of x, y, and z. And so a vector 3 is exactly that. It's the three vectors. It's x, the y, and the z. And so we're just going to essentially move it 1 unit on the x axis, and we'll leave the rest at 0. And so that will move it 1 unit to the right of the character. And then we'll say otherwise, if the movement.x is equal to -1, all right, I am going to do the same thing. Okay, so I'm going to actually just select this whole line. I'm going to Control C and copy it, and then I'll paste it here, and I'm going to set this to -1 now. And that will put it to the left of the character 1 unit. And I'll say otherwise, if the movement.y is equal to 1, so that is the up axis, all right, or the y axis from the character. So when they're moving up, I'm going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to copy this line again, and I am instead going to take this here and I am going to set this to 0, and I will set this y to 1, and that will move it 1 unit up. Otherwise, we'll do the same thing here. Movement.y set equal to -1 this time, so that is down. We will go ahead and copy this line, and I'm sure you've guessed at this point, we will set this to -1 instead. All right, so once we've set this up here, we need to actually call this method here. All right, so you can see how it's kind of dim. That just means it's not being called at all yet. So we'll scroll back up here and we'll go to update. And in update, we will call the set fire position, which will be called every frame. So we'll check that, and it will run those checks every frame. So go ahead and save this now. And I will go back to the engine. And I need to drag a reference to the fire point in the fire point section there, and a reference to the hero in the hero point section of the script. All right. And then I'm going to go ahead and select the fire point. And if I press play now, you'll see that the fire point adjusts, all right, based on my movement. So I don't like how it's a little too close there to the character when he's going down, if you see um, right here. So I'm going to just adjust that a little bit. I'll go back to the script. And so that was the down on the -1 on the Y. So I'll set this to like 1.5 and save it. And I'm just going to go ahead and run it again now. Yep, and that looks a lot better. So it's all kind of even. It's about 1 unit away from the character now. Okay, so the reason we did that is so that we can make another script now and basically spawn an arrow from that location there. So we'll go ahead and do that now. So before we can start scripting and adding in the script to create the arrow, we need to go ahead and set up the actual keystroke or button press that we want to spawn the arrow. So we can do that by going to Edit and Project Settings, and we'll click the input manager here. And so if we open this up, all right, we'll see that we have all these different inputs, all right? And you'll even see the horizontal and vertical which we've referenced already. So these are the actual axes that we reference. You can see that horizontal says left and right, or A and D. You can actually assign what the horizontal axis will be set to, and so we can assign the different button presses here that we want to set it up with. So it's same with vertical. We have the W key is the positive, so that's the +1, that's up, and S is -1, so that's down. But we're going to create a new keystroke essentially. So I'm going to set this to 31 instead now. and you'll see down here that it actually created another debug horizontal input. So I want to name this, instead of debug horizontal, I'll name it attack. I don't want a negative button, and I'm going to set the positive button to Q. And for the type, I'm going to set it as, instead of a joystick axis, I'm going to set it as a key or mouse button. Okay. And so we've set up the inputs now that we need. I just like Q. You can really send it to whatever you'd like. You can set it to like left control or something along that line. But I'm going to leave it as Q. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out now. And now I'm going to click on the hero and I'm going to write a script that will use that keystroke to create an arrow. So I'll go ahead and add the component, and I will go ahead and add new script, and I will call this shoot arrow. Okay. And I'm going to move this script to my scripts folder. And then I'll click on the hero again, and we'll see that we have the shoot arrow script on the hero. And I'm going to double click that, and we are now in the actual script itself. So we'll go ahead and start writing some code here. So we'll delete the start because we don't want start. We don't need it in this scenario. I'm going to want a reference to the fire point object. I'm going to also want a reference to the arrow prefab we just made. I'm also going to want a variable to control the force with which we add force to the arrow. And now that we have all of the variables and references we need to have set, we'll go into update here and we'll do an if check. And remember, this runs every frame, so this will check this every frame. And we will say if the input.get button down. So we are accessing the input class, and in the input class, we have access to a method called get button down. And this returns true that the frame presses the button that we indicate down, and it takes a string, button name. And so we just created an attack button. So we'll go ahead and type that in, like so. And we now have a direct kind of link to the attack button when the attack button gets pressed. And then in here, we're going to call a function called shoot. We haven't created it yet, so we'll get some errors. It'll try to autocomplete it, but we just want to call it shoot. And then underneath the closing bracket, so make sure you have remember, you can mouse over the brackets to tell you what is the opening bracket. So we want to make sure that we're under update here, but we are inside of the class bracket. We'll go ahead and put void shoot, like so. And we'll write the method here. And what we're going to go ahead and do is we are going to use a method called instantiate. Okay, clones the object original and returns the clone. Okay, and it takes a game object, vector3 position, and a quaternion rotation. So it takes the position. That's just quaternion is essentially what is used to measure the rotation angles. So we'll go ahead and we will select instantiate, like so, and we want to give it the arrow prefab. Okay, so that's the game object. So that's the arrow we just created. We are going to take the fire point. Okay, so that is the object that was the child of the hero game object. And we're going to take that position value. So the positional value of that object, and then we're also going to take the rotational value of that object as well. Okay? And we actually want to try and add a force as well to that arrow. So we're going to create a game object variable called arrow, and we're going to set it equal to that instantiate method here. And this will be a temporary variable we are using to hold um, the arrow that gets created when we press the button. So basically, if we run down this just really quick, we're going to press the button, right? It's going to go into this method. We'll be inside of this method here, and it will instantiate that arrow with the fire point's position and the fire point's rotation, and then we're going to store that in a temporary game object variable that we've kind of set here. And then we're going to go ahead and we're actually going to create another local variable in this method called of rigid body 2D. Okay, so remember the rigid body is what allows the variable to have access to the Unity's physics engine. And we're going to set, we'll just do RB short for rigid body, and we'll say arrow dot get component. Okay, and I'll explain this in a moment here. Rigid body 2D. So what we've done here in this line is we are accessing, okay, the arrow that we just created, okay, and that is created from the arrow prefab. So we spawn the arrow prefab, which has a rigid body component on it. So like if we go back to the editor, I'm just going to save this. It's going to compile when we go back to the editor, so we'll just have to wait a second. Okay, so if we go back to the editor and we go to the assets folder and then prefabs, all right, what we're spawning is this. We're spawning this arrow prefab, okay? And this has a rigid body 2D component on it, okay? And so remember, game objects can have these components. Components can have different functionality, right? And so rigid body 2D is the component that allows the 2D object to interact with Unity's physics engine and have it physics applied to it. So what we are doing in this line of code here is accessing that arrow's rigid body component, okay, so that we can do something with it. And we're storing that in a variable. And so now we're going to add a force to that rigid body, to that to the arrow, and we're going to say fire point dot forward, like so. All right, and that's the forward vector of the object, okay, of the fire point, and we're going to multiply that by arrow force, okay, so that was the variable we set in up above to 20f, 20 float, and we will go ahead and we will access this force mode, and this is, as you can see, option for how to apply a force using rigid body 2D dot add force. So we will access the force mode and we'll choose impulse. Add an instant force impulse to the rigid body using its mass. So it will just immediately add a force to it and move it in the direction that we've stipulated here. So the forward, it will move it in the forward direction. It will add the force and it will be it will pulse once to shoot the arrow. So it's still the script's still a bit of a work in progress. So we will go back to the editor here now, and we'll go and select the hero, and we'll scroll down, and we need to set up the references. So in the script here, okay, the fire point is going to take the fire point of the hero. The arrow prefab was the one that we just created here, so we'll drag that in there. and everything else is pretty set up. We have the force there as well. So now if we save this and we play, all right, um, we'll see that the arrow prefab clones here are spawning, but I made a mistake, so I will press play again. And we need to go to the arrow, and the reason we're not seeing it is because it is 0 in the order and layer, so we will make this a 1, the same as our hero. We'll save it, and then we will play, and now we see it spawns an arrow. So the issue is that the arrow doesn't really orient correctly at the moment. Um, so that is something I will address I'll try to address in a later video. Though we will be moving on next week to Unity 3D engine, 3D part of the engine. So the only other thing I wanted to do also is I actually wanted to adjust this. So if you look at the arrow, it doesn't look pixelated, right? So we want to fix that. So if we go back down to, we'll go in the Tiny RPG Forest and artwork, sprites, and then the miscellaneous folder, and then back into the actual arrow sprite. All right. I'm going to change the filter mode. Okay, the reason that it's smooth is because it has this filter mode as set to bilinear. And we don't want that. We don't want any filters on it because we want it to be pixelated. So we're going to select point no filter, like so. And let me just make sure everything else looks okay. It does. We'll click apply. And now I'm going to save everything, and I'm going to just try to run it again to make sure that it's kind of pixelated. Yep. As you can see here, it's a little bit more pixelated. And so it does have a bit of a force when we're walking and we shoot it. But when we're standing still, it kind of just spawns, and it doesn't do exactly what we want it to do. So that's, like I said, it'll be something that's probably going to have to be adjusted in a later video. But we have this all kind of set up here for now, and that'll do it for this session. So if you have any questions, let me know. Other than that, have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next session.